Let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to our kind of little alumni panel today. My name's Zach Powers. I'm the PLU Director of Communication and also managed 3 campaigns after I graduated from PLU in 2010. A couple of state legislative campaigns here in Tacoma, and also a little Tacoma School Board campaign. That was a lot of fun. And I would ask all the panelists, we'll go around, if you could introduce yourself, share where you work now and what you do now, and also share with us 2 campaigns that you've worked on or volunteered on or were involved with that mean a lot to you. We'll start with Barbara.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Barbara. I am a very recent PLU grad. I actually graduated in May 2020, so just a few months ago. I majored in global studies, psychology, and political science. Currently, I work as a campaign director for Argo Strategies, which is a consulting firm based out of Seattle. And 2 of the most memorable campaigns I've worked on. First one, definitely Representative Melanie Morgan for the 29th LD. Privileged to be her campaign manager in 2018. And also working for her again in 2020. And then other one, Janie Hitchin for Pierce County Council, District 6, which also impacts PLU. Definitely, I think, one of the hottest local races that we have right now in Washington State. And then should I pass it off?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, I'll pass it to Shannon.
Hello, good evening. I'm Shannon Murphy. I'm the Chief Campaigns Officer for Washington Conservation Voters. I've been there about 13 years in various capacities. So I've worked on a lot of different races. Let's see, before that, I majored in communications and have minors in public affairs and Spanish from PLU. So I took that and went into politics. The 2 races that I've probably made the biggest impact on me was the 2012 Governor Jay Inslee race. That was the first time we had a governor run on climate, and as my kind of #1 passion, that was really exciting to see. And I worked on it from Washington Conservation Voters' perspective, from something called independent expenditures. And then the other race was very local. In 2015 and 2017, I worked on 2 Port of Vancouver races that in the end helped stop the largest oil by rail terminal being built in North America, which was a huge fight against Tesoro Oil and hundreds of thousands of dollars coming in from Texas. So it was a very interesting fight, David and Goliath fight that is very special in my heart. So I'll pass it to Aaron now.
Thanks so much, Shannon, and thanks, Barbara, and thanks, Zach, and thanks to PLU for hosting this afternoon, or evening, I guess, at this point. Still losing track here. Time isn't real on Zoom. Anyway, I graduated from Pacific Lutheran back in 2011, where I double majored in philosophy and political science, but also shout out PLU debate. That was really my jam at the time. 2 of the campaigns that were really important for me were back-to-back in the years 2013 and 2014. 2013, I was originally from SeaTac, Washington, and right after I got out of grad school, the $15 an hour campaign in SeaTac, which ended up being the launching pad for the movement nationwide, was just bringing on field organizers. And I was at the time thinking I was gonna, end up in like school administration, but that completely altered my career trajectory. SeaTac at the time was 11,000 registered voters, but it ended up just, the amount of money that went in for such a small town. I just had to get in because nothing was going to be a part of the national dialogue from SeaTac Washington ever again. And it ended up winning by 77 votes and is just, I don't forget that campaign. It's kind of really important for me personally, and I think in our contemporary political landscape. And then in the next year, I ended up managing another municipal campaign. Derek Young, who is currently a Pierce County Council member, and that race was unique. Another nail biter where we won by like 112 votes. It was a red tide in 2014. We were the only campaign in the state as a Democratic campaign to unseat a Republican incumbent and break a Republican supermajority on the Pierce County Council. And shout out Janie Hitchin. She's going to finish the job and make sure the Democrats turn the Pierce County Council.
All right.
Hey, I love it.
I do too, but this is technically. Where do you work now, Aaron?
Oh yeah, I am the communications manager for King County Council member Girmay Zahalai.
All right. So, I want to, as much as we can, kind of like talk about kind of like principles of campaigns, and I think today we're going to be talking kind of like a local through statewide seems like a lot to me. So maybe like local through legislative or local through congressional, and if Shannon wants to share a little bit about her experience statewide, or if Barbara's involved with some statewide stuff at Argo this year, then we can kind of share about those things. But I think we're going to be talking with a focus on candidate campaigns, but we do have some folks here who have worked on issue campaigns, probably it sounds like all three. And so we'll just kind of like talk generally about kind of some of the qualities and goals and things that all campaigns have to do. And then maybe if we're talking about like something that's especially applicable to large campaigns, we'll say so, or small campaigns, we'll say so. Kind of like to briefly lay a foundation, I'm wondering if we can go around and I wrote 3 to 5 in our notes here, but let's make it 2 to 3. If you each could share like 2 to 3 things that you think are like fundamental elements of a winning campaign. And let's start with Aaron.
Field, and field. As one of my first bosses would have told me when I was working on the CTAC minimum wage. There are a lot of elements, but fundamentally you're volunteer based. But as a candidate, especially, your commitment to do as much direct voter contact as possible, especially in a local race, is just something that cannot be beat. That's how incumbents often fall, is because a young challenger decides that they're just going to outdoor knock you. Obviously, things are a little bit different, but the successful campaign, if I'm looking for one thing, it's how many doors are you hitting? What does your direct voter contact look like? And in a digital environment, I think a lot of that does have to do with your social media apparatus. I think that slowly we are seeing the social media influencer model that people are using for profit in mediums like YouTube and Instagram is starting to bleed over into candidate campaigns. And that transition has really happened and been forced. And so more and more, it's what does your brand look like as a candidate online? I think that's going to be a factor we're going to unseal. So for me, field and digital are the way that you win a small campaign.
Barbara, what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think I'm going to echo a lot of what Aaron shared. As someone that's working on 2 county council races right now, really, really local races, and also especially with my experience with Representative Melanie Morgan, I think the number one thing that I always look for in a campaign and really to see how successful are we going to be is what does your direct voter contact look like? This year, 2020, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so it looks really different. I mean, originally when plans were drafted, everyone was saying, hey, you're going to knock this many doors, you need to talk to this many people and shake this many hands. What we're doing this year really looks more like phone banking. So we're talking to voters over the phone. We're doing a lot more mailers. I think besides your direct voter contact, one of the things that's really important is how are you going to fundraise? The reality is that campaigns do cost a lot of money. And so having the money to fund all of your direct voter contact and your mailers and your things like that is really, really important. I guess the third thing would really be, like how many people are excited about your campaign, who's excited for you to be there. Aaron mentioned volunteers. Volunteers are really the lifeline of campaigns. I think it's amazing and so moving to see how many people are willing to show up for a candidate and to just do work because they love this person. So how can you get people energized, and how many people are excited about you, or do you know will be excited about you when they hear about your campaign?
Shannon?
To not repeat others, I will go with building your kind of community base of support and then earning endorsements as validators. So those 2 things are really important when you're talking to voters, particularly in nonpartisan races. A lot of voters in this partisan environment vote just if they're a Democrat or a Republican, but in nonpartisan races, you need validators, and validators come from either community members that are well known, or local and statewide organizations that are well known. Those validators are also very important for fundraising. Unfortunately, fundraising is really important to get your message out to voters. It helps get your message out to voters in addition to knocking on doors. And it is very nice to have a validator like an organization that someone has heard of, particularly in local races where the name ID is just going to be a lot lower than what you'd see for a statewide candidate.
Gotcha. So folks might not have heard of you, but if they've heard of a couple of organizations that support you, or if they, oh, labor, that makes sense. I guess real quick, could someone run through at what levels and what offices in Washington are partisan, where you declare a party affiliation on the ballot, and which ones aren't? Barbara, can you walk us through it?
I'm walking through most of it.
Yeah.
Since I'm really new to this, newish. So obviously your governor is going to be a partisan race. People are going to talk about that with your Washington state representatives, your senators for the district that you live in. Those are going to be partisan. Your county council is partisan. Your executive of your county council is going to be partisan. What other races am I missing? I should have my voters pamphlet next to me while I'm answering this.
Yeah, your school boards and your city councils.
Those
basically
are all
everything county and small. Well, technically, most in King County and Pierce County, our county council members represent more people than I think legislators do. But basically, everything county and municipal. I'm going to come back to a bunch of things that you all hit on. But I think, as we're kind of starting to think about this process of, I hope in the next, half hour or so, we'll kind of walk through these different stages and give people a lot to think about. When we think about, you all, have worked with a lot of different types of candidates. There's not one type of person. There's not one type of personality that makes a great candidate. I wonder if you could all tell me just like a couple of qualities that you look for in a potential strong candidate. I'm not talking about a potential strong elected official, and unfortunately, those are sometimes different things. But when you're looking for in a candidate, both personality, professional background, community base, like how do you think about it when you're thinking about, ooh, it'd really be great if we could find someone to run for this open seat or something like that. Maybe Shannon, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think the number one thing I look for is someone that really knows their community and ideally has been there for a while. It's really nice. It's a lot harder for a candidate to build that base of support if they haven't been in the community for a while and just know history and know people. And so that's kind of number one. The other thing I look for a candidate is just being dynamic. They are going to be talking to so many voters and so many potential donors and be on panels and forums and debates. They need to have a dynamic personality. That doesn't necessarily need to be like an extrovert, but they need to be able to engage with people because ultimately they're going to be representing those constituents. And so they need to be engaging. And then I think third is I look for candidates that really can demonstrate and be articulate about their values and what they stand for. Particularly in today's day, I think it's a lot harder even for local candidates to have kind of a wishy-washy platform or something that's not standing for something specific. It's just not our times that we are in right now. Voters are looking for, positions and value statements from the candidates themselves.
I'm going to move us in kind of a three-part. So I'm going to ask Aaron a question and then Barbara. Aaron, you kind of, since your campaign days have gone on, kind of specialize in political messaging. You worked for the Senate Democratic Caucus, and now you, as you mentioned, communications for a King County council member. So I'm going to throw this one to you. A lot of what candidates kind of sort out is what's your kind of 30 to 45 second doorbell pitch, or what you're saying when you get in front of an endorsement committee, or how do you encourage someone to think about that, to approach that? It can be overwhelming because people have lots of things they want to do or lots of reasons they're running, and you want it to be kind of universal. I don't want to answer the questions for you. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, developing the You know, what we're talking about to some degree is manufacturing authenticity. And authenticity is just the currency in politics right now. People want to feel like the person that they are talking to, absent of their specific values, is somebody that's being real, that's being forthright from them. And the way you want to find that out about candidates, oftentimes it's talking to their family and friends, because they'll tell you the truth about the person that you're engaging with and what they want. And oftentimes that's what, in an endorsement interview, in a direct voter contact, yes, you want to have your values nailed down and what you're fighting for, but that conversation these days is secondary to, is this a person that I think is telling me the truth and earnestly wants to make, our community better? Just going back to 1 second, and how do you evaluate what a good candidate is? I'm going to steal a line from a consultant that's a friend of mine. When you first meet with somebody, you let them pick the spot, and they're going to be somebody that is going to fight for their community. If when they're at that coffee shop or restaurant, people come up to them at the place of business and know their name, that means they've invested time in their community. You're just trying to replicate that when you are getting out over and over again, and demonstrating what that investment in community is what does authentic engagement look like? How do you bring that? Who is your authentic self? And lead with vulnerability. Vulnerability is the internal link to authenticity. And so the more that you're able to express that in everyday interactions, the more people are going to trust you. And so when you're developing that 30 to 45 seconds, it needs to be brutally honest about who you are, because people can sense the talking point, right? So it's also easy for the candidate, right? Is when you're actually just able to be yourself, be able to let your freak flag fly, people are going to resonate with that, because we all have our own individual freak flag on some level.
Well, it seems like, well, never mind. I don't want to get us hung up on that. Barbara, you work for one of the things that your firm does when you start working with a candidate, when what's going to be a 6-month or 8-month or 12-month process, is you work with them to create kind of a comprehensive campaign plan. What goes into that process, and how does that campaign plan vary based on the candidate or the office or the region?
Yeah, so one of the things you really look at is what can you feasibly accomplish within this period? What is the area that you're looking at targeting? One of the big portions of that is kind of what's the voting history of this area, and that goes far beyond just what way does this district lean politically, but it also goes into how many people are going to turn out to vote. One of the big things is the 29th LD, which is where PLU is situated, is actually the lowest voting district in Washington state, and consistently does that. This year, though, we're seeing this really, really big change where way more people have turned out to vote in the 29th LD. So, I mean, it kind of messes a little bit with the campaign plan when things like that happen, but that's really, really good that more people are turning out. Beyond that, one of the things you look at is, who is your candidate? What can you get your candidate to do? So Janie Hitchin, who I am working with right now, is actually a teacher. She works full time right now. And so one of the ways that her plan was situated is, what can you do during the summer? And we have to really overload the summer period where you're not working at all, so we can get all of these calls made. But now that she's gone back to school and is teaching, that looks really, really different, because she's devoting most of her day to educating students. Beyond that, I think one of the things you also look at, is what are the goals that your campaign really wants to accomplish. One of the big things for Representative Morgan is that she really, really wanted to increase voter registration in the 29th LD, and she really wanted to build a coalition of youth. So when you look at, who do you want to target, you're going to change around your campaign plan a little bit. And then, of course, along the way, inevitably, there will be a time where you just feel like you should rip up the campaign plan and nothing is going how you thought it was going to go, which is, I think, how most people have felt in 2020 in general. But for the most part, you kind of start formulating these ideas really first when someone says, hey, I want to run. How do I even start going about this? And those are the core things that you'll look at.
Before I get to our next question, I also want to share that we're going to hold about 20 minutes at the end of this, from about 6:47 for questions. And if you type in questions using the chat at the bottom center of your Zoom, then there's someone behind the scenes who's going to put them on our Google Doc, and we will knock those out later on in about 15-20 minutes. I think that's a good segue to my next question I want to ask, was about, how do you go about building, coalitions of advocates, activists, and volunteers? One thing that I encourage people to think about when they're talking to me about running in Tacoma is, oftentimes it seems like a good candidate maybe has like a couple communities behind them already. Someone's a teacher who's also involved in the LGBTQ communities. You kind of have a foundational, like, okay, well, we'll start with those two communities and we'll kind of draw out. But sometimes people don't have kind of those sorts of starting places. Sometimes I always think it's interesting. I always tell people too, like sometimes you're going to be disappointed about who doesn't come out and like get involved with your campaign, and then really overwhelmed with gratitude about those who do that you wouldn't expect. Can we talk a little bit about how you go about, again, in like an 8 to 10 month period, especially maybe in kind of a more local county legislative level, putting together those coalitions? Let's start with Shannon.
Yeah, my experience is a little bit different because I come from the organizational perspective. So I'm usually one of those organizations that is interested in a candidate and help build from the organization perspective. So I'm in an environmental community, for example. In a dream world, an ideal situation, those coalitions are built on the front end, and you're kind of moving a candidate into a coalition that fits those values. So when you're if there's and sometimes with local races, not always, and sometimes in local issues, there's one big issue that is dominating the race. So in my experience, I've been in with local races where what was on the line was a fossil fuel terminal being built. Tacoma has something similar with LNG plant right now, where the race is about the candidate, but it's also about the issue. And so when that happens, usually a candidate, if they have a very specific position, can kind of blend in with the coalition already, right? And really kind of own the same values as the coalition that's already been built. If you don't have that and the race is a little bit has less of a profile, then I would say you have to build it brick by brick. And that is participating in every single endorsement interview that you can, taking everyone seriously, going to the newspaper endorsement forums. I think the worst thing a candidate can do is to not take all of those opportunities seriously. So every neighborhood group, every League of Women's Voters Forum, all of those make a huge difference, because to go back to my earlier point, validators, you need one validator to get another validator to get another validator. It's often a domino effect. So there's a saying that money follows money. I would say validators follow validators in politics. And so to building a coalition it's really one baby step at a time. And there's no fast lane, if you will.
Erin, could you share a little bit, maybe as a case study, because I think a lot of the, the dozen or so people on our call will be kind of familiar with the geography of Pierce County. You mentioned working for Derek Young, who was a Gig Harbor City Council member who then ran for county council in a district that's mostly, I believe, Tacoma, or probably Tacoma's 2/3 of that district. So someone who was well liked in Gig Harbor, people knew his name in Tacoma, but not much about him. So can you kind of, as a case study, just kind of share a few kind of highlights about how you all went about with this Gig Harbor leader kind of walking through Tacoma and getting to know some new communities?
Yeah, I think at its core, thinking back on the 2014 campaign, I mean, it was really teaming up with a couple of other campaigns that we knew we were aligned with. Like, I think a really core part in building our coalition in 2014 was the fact that we shared an office space and on 6th Ave in Tacoma with Lori Jenkins, Jake Fye, and Derek Kilmer. And I think that we really made it our... Sorry, what was that?
Who those folks are?
Oh, sorry, I didn't. So we had an office space that we shared on 6th Ave with Representative Jenkins, Representative Fye, and Congressman Derek Kilmer. And I think that in order to get that credibility, a lot of it was we realized that all boats were going to rise together. And so you better believe that when we went out on doors from Derek Young's campaign, we had lit for Lori Jenkins and for Jake Fye and for Derek Kilmer. And that went both ways, right? And it was sharing that work basis. And it was that association, because as my grandpa would tell you, you're known by the company you keep. And I think that like being able to be, again, validated, as Shannon was talking about people that were familiar in the community. But also that is like, in terms of building coalitions when you're meeting with people, it's all about local institutions, right? Derek Young held so many meetings at Bluebeard on 6th Ave, right? And that was just that. I mean, part of it is they make great coffee. Like everybody knows that, but it's an institution. You know, Zach, you and I used to see each other walking on Sunday mornings on the way to Bluebeard, right? Like that's the kind of signal that you know something about the community. If you saw a campaign sign at MSM, you know you're getting votes, right? And so it's that kind of local institution identification, the validators who you associate yourself with, that really develops those core. What are the key indicators that people associate with Tacoma that you then want to associate with yourself? It's through location, it's through individuals, and it's through the investment that you make again in field.
Barbara, can that process be different or challenging in districts that are kind of more suburban or more kind of not necessarily geographically spread out, but whether it's the 29th or some of these other county districts, there's no kind of like downtown or like center or hub. You know, does that make that process a little trickier, or is it largely the same?
I think yes and no. I think especially when you're looking at the 29th, I mean, kind of with where PLU is situated, it's kind of created a small hub within Parkland for folks to, you know, kind of come to and see. But I think, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. One of the challenges with Representative Morgan's first campaign is while she had that name recognition of sitting on the Franklin Pierce School Board, Franklin Pierce is only covers so many areas. And so really when she was looking to go somewhere else, it became this game of like, how do you get your lit into these buildings for them to pass out? How do you get your sign up? How do you get this organization to put your sign up in front of this building so you can get more name recognition? Whereas if you're looking at, you know, a place like the 28th LD, which is where I grew up, you know, DuPont has a very central downtown. You know what it's going to look like. You know the rest of its housing. Stillicum is kind of the same way. You drive through its town really on the way to Lakewood, and then Lakewood, of course, has the whole Lakewood Town Center, and then there's housing built around it. So it's a lot easier just to access a lot of those places. You know that, you know, everyone in that area is going to have to drive through it at some point. So it helps out a lot. Whereas in the 29th, you know, you're kind of playing a little bit more of a bargain of, okay, if I'm in Parkland, are they going to drive through here? What does it look like when I go to Spanaway? You know, how is that going to look for us?
Thanks, guys. So right now, I'd have to look, but I think, you know, to run for city council in Tacoma, maybe say, you know, for an open at-large seat, to run competitively, I think has been costing about $65,000 or $70,000. Maybe people have run with a little bit less, maybe people have spent some more, but just say 65 or 70,000. I think that's kind of in the mean right now. If you've never run for office, or maybe you were appointed to the school board, but you never really had to do this, that sounds so overwhelming. People are going to give me $60,000 so I can spend it all in 8 months' time on myself, on my name. Like, it just, like, you know, I always say, like, the right people run for office never want to run for office, right? And that's part of why. But yet people figure it out. How do you, and anyone can jump in here, I'm just wondering, like, what do you say to, you know, someone who would be a great candidate, you want to run, but they're like, how am I going to raise $65,000 that you're telling me will make me a competitive candidate? Anyone jump in?
Well, you actually are asking a question that I should say that there's a reason that we need to ask women and people of color 7 to 8 times to run for office before they are willing to do so, because it is so overwhelming and it's very daunting. But, you know, the very first thing that any political consultant or someone who's worked in campaigns will tell candidates is to make a list of every single person you know, including your first grade teacher. And anyone you know, you're going to first call them. So it's easiest to ask, you know, your sister and mom and dad for money. And then you go from there. And then once you exhaust that list, that I feel like I'm a broken record here, but that's why the validators are so important, because you need them to help you raise money. And so to your point earlier, Zach, about being kind of plugged into some natural communities, hopefully, you know, if you've been on the school board, you have some education advocates that can help and they can plug in. So your next ask after you've exhausted your list is asking people specifically to help raise money and kind of get more into those communities where someone might not know you, but because of what you stand for or what you represent, they'll want to give you money. So that's kind of how you do it. And then I would say it's one phone call at a time. I think it was Aaron, or maybe it was Barbara, who said, you know, a candidate really should be doing two things: knocking on doors or making dialing for dollars. Everything else your volunteers and staff should be doing for you, because you should. Those are the two things that really candidates can only do. Because they're selling their self, they're selling their vision, they're selling, you know, what they want to accomplish representing the constituents in their district.
Barbara, you're probably working with some first-time candidates, or maybe are you this year?
I am, yes.
How's that?
So, yeah, what that looks like, working with Janny. Janny's a first-time candidate, and I can say that it's a really daunting task to raise that money. And I think, you know, as Shannon was saying, it really highlights one of the biggest inequities in our system right now, is that the reality is that you cannot win if you don't raise enough money, because lit costs money, mail costs a ton of money, you know, reaching out to people costs a lot of money. And, you know, for some candidates, you know, they look at that and they go, oh, that's fine. I can, you know, in kind myself a couple $1,000s and I'll be on my way. Or I know a lot of people who can give me a couple $1,000s, no problem. But for, you know, other candidates, especially for first-time candidates who don't already have that name recognition, who can't say, you know, last year I was also endorsed by these people, they're going to endorse me again or something like that, raising that amount of money from scratch is really, really hard. I think, you know, one of the big things that we're seeing this year is that what's so great, I think, especially in Janny's case, has been the amount of other people who are elected officials who go, oh, hey, actually, I have this list that you can also call to. We know that people who have donated to races before are really likely to donate to yours, especially if they've donated to the seat that you're running for, they're really likely to donate again. And so you really dig into your network of, here are people who have ran for this position before, who have similar values to me. I'm going to use the list that they called through after I exhaust my family and friends and everyone I know. And then really kind of after that, you start, you know, having that, like Shannon was saying, really that coalition that you have built behind you. They're the people who are going to start giving you those lists for you to help raise that money. And also likely the people that are going to start donating to you. Getting an endorsement oftentimes means getting money with it. That helps you build that up. And then what's, you know, really interesting about that is once the money starts coming in, people really want to start donating now. And if you win, people are going to start donating to you again because now they want you to win again. So I think, you know, there are tons of benefits to running a second time or running for another office after you've successfully held one office. But being a first-time candidate is really challenging, you know, just because the fear of what am I going to do when I raise this much money? And I think it's even more challenging when you have a candidate that comes from a low socioeconomic background, you know, looking at this, I'm going to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially, and I'm going to watch it all go away, but my name is on the account and I'm going to sign all these checks, you know, and what does that mean for them? And what does that highlight in our system?
Does anyone else want to jump in on that or move on? Fundraising is not the most enjoyable thing to do on a campaign or talk about on a campaign panel. So, let's see. So I want to remind folks who are watching again that we're going to take questions from the audience, but right now we don't have any. So we're going to keep plugging away here. What is the relationship? Can we talk about the relationship between maybe like city council or legislative or county council campaigns, which are local campaigns, but like, you know, the four of us have all worked on even smaller campaigns, you know, school board campaigns, you know, park commissioner, you know, things like that. And I'm kind of talking about the level above that, but the level then below like Congress, which is kind of this county council, state legislature, city council and mayor at you know, bigger cities. So on that level, you know, So we talked about endorsements. Organizations will endorse you, whether it's your local carpenters union or a chapter of your local Young Democrats or Republicans, although not you all kind of showed your cards on those already. What comes with that? There's sometimes money involved, there's sometimes expertise involved, there's sometimes like, I want to kind of go back to the coalition building, and like, how do you bring people in? A lot of times these campaigns start with a candidate who often hires then, if they can afford it or if they can project to afford it, a consultant. Often there's a few really good consultants in Pierce County. There's more in Seattle, like the one that Barbara works for. So you have your consultant, you have maybe a part-time campaign manager to start, and you kind of build and build and build. And then these endorsers come on and your coalition gets bigger. And how does the campaign kind of like grow? Both resource-wise, visually, and brand-wise, and then like cooks in the kitchen. Maybe from Aaron and Barbara to start, kind of the campaign managers who were like, wait a minute, we started in May and it was just like me and my candidate in the garage, and now there's all these people around and ideas and thoughts. And what's that process like of a campaign kind of butterflying into like a full campaign come October?
It's unique every single time. I really kind of think about the momentum changes, right? And it feels like it's a bunch of individual moments, and a lot of the time, like I wish I come with better words for it, but it's you feel the energy around a campaign, and you're trying to create a certain type of magnetism which is going to allow you to snowball through election day. Like, you should be at your most powerful as a campaign on election day, right? And you want to continue building that momentum. It's really just a game of, that's where those endorsements do kind of come into play, because a lot of the time that's leveraging volunteers. That's where like LDs can really come into play. And I remember when I first started on Derek's campaign, like I already mentioned it once, but it was literally me, his consultant, and Derek just at a table at Bluebeard. I still have my marble notebook from when we started it, and it's all faded at this point, but the process to get there is you got to be known by your reputation first. People will notice if they see you out knocking doors, people on social media, right? You have to demonstrate the work, because there's a double game going on. It's not just, you have to do the work first as well, but then you have to demonstrate that you're doing that work, and that draws people in, right? That's where digital, I think, has really changed the game. In social media, I mentioned earlier this influencer model that I think is starting to become more and more prevalent, especially for individual candidates, is, it's important to go out and knock doors. It's the bread and butter, but people want to see you knocking doors. I remember being behind closed doors with organizations and consultants that are looking through our books and saying, how many doors have you hit, right? And they want to see it too, and they need to feel it as well. So that's like how I really remember the momentum shifting, is where it went from one day where it was just the three of us at a table, but I mean, and look, I'll admit, I remember one time a consultant, I'm a more heavy set guy. He saw that I had lost at least 15 pounds knocking doors. And you know what? That's how they knew that we were working hard, right? People want to see that, find your angle. And that draws people in, along with a magnetic personality, always helpful.
Barbara, have you experienced that kind of growth and expansion that a campaign goes through?
Yeah, being just about 2 weeks away from the general election, I'll say it happens way too fast. Not quite sure how we got here right now. I'm glad that we are here, but it really goes by fast. I think, going back to Representative Morgan's first campaign, it really did go back to when we were able to door knock. It really started when she was able to, when we could be in person, when she was able to show up to events. And these aren't big events, right? These aren't things that she's planning herself for this race. These are things that were like, hey, there's a barbecue in the park going on. How about you go make an appearance there and talk to some people? It's those little moments where one day you're out doorbelling and someone says, oh, hey, I think I remember getting something from your campaign or something about your campaign, where it starts to grow. And then, of course, because we have this primary then general election system, doing really well in the primary, that I think is really just a giant spurt of growth for your campaign. Showing that you are a strong candidate is something that really kind of blows it up. But I think it's something that at first you really don't realize that your campaign's growing, and then suddenly you look back and you're like, oh, hey, when did we get 50 volunteers to show up to do this, when Originally it was like me and you in the car trying to drive around and hit, 5,000 doors, and we didn't know how we were going to get it done.
All right, we've got a question. Do you have any advice for someone who would like to help run a campaign in the future? And Barbara, let's start again with you, just because you kind of are the one who's most recently kind of done that transition.
I would definitely say start making that known now. See where you can get involved. I think one of the best ways to start with that is to really start volunteering for things. And it doesn't even have to be campaigns. It can also be for specific candidates, I should say. It should also, being involved with lobbying days. If there's an issue that you're really passionate about, getting involved there. If you can, doing an internship with the state is a really, really great way to get involved. If you align yourself with a specific party, interning and working for them can really, really help as well. I had a really untraditional path. I took a class with someone who was they were a non-traditional PLU student, and he was already really involved in campaigns. That was his job. And then I was in class with him, and he thought I would be super great to be on Representative Morgan's campaign. So sometimes it's also just that. It's just kind of being in the right place at the right time. Talking about your beliefs, I think, is kind of the best way to get started in it. It seems really, really daunting at first, but also just having that little bit of confidence of like, hey, you do know what you're doing, I think also goes a really long way. And stepping up to take initiative gets you more notice to put you in positions to start running campaigns.
Let's kind of stay there too. Let's talk about, and Barbara, you kind of shared this, Shannon and Aaron, what were you involved in during your college years? What there was on campus or off campus in the Tacoma, Parkland area, or back, maybe where you were from? What were you involved in that then kind of helped you get going? Aaron, I know the first campaign I think you worked on because I was managing it. I mean, you'd already interned for a congressperson, but let's start with Aaron.
Yeah, so I did do an internship the fall semester of my freshman year, which in hindsight was a little ambitious. I think I made the classic mistake that everybody makes in college, which is like, oh, in high school I was doing, 0-hour jazz band at 6:30 in the morning. How hard could an 8 a.m. internship for my first semester possibly be? And I was like taking the bus all the way over to. I was interning for Congressman Smith back when he had his offices in Fife. So I was like taking the bus 3 days a week over from my dorm room in Foss over to the Fife headquarters for Congressman Smith. But I again, it was just like through connections. I was interested in it. I still do to some degree, but back then especially wore my hometown of SeaTac on my sleeve and just wanted to be involved with the people that had the power to influence those changes. And with Adam Smith, he's also from SeaTac, so I was like, yeah, man, he's the guy if I want to follow the path. But so that was kind of my trajectory. I did a couple campaigns while I was on campus, but for me, I think what set me up for success in a political profession afterwards were two things. I mean, definitely the debate program at PLU just exposed me to so many different ideas. The ability to articulate them in a competitive environment was really helpful for me because in addition to helping me sort out what I believed, it was challenging me to take on and be able to advocate effectively for new ideas or sometimes ideas I didn't necessarily agree with. And so developing that skill set was important. But also shout out to the philosophy department at PLU. That critical thinking set that really challenged me in an academically rigorous environment, and also just the pure amount of writing that I had to do was so important for me once I got into politics, especially in communications, because just being able to write quickly on the fly, edit, was such an invaluable skill set. And those are the things that when you get into politics that people are really looking for is creativity, the ability to grind out whatever assignments that you've got and have a commitment to be able to live in the topic or candidate space that you're in for those 8 months. You really gotta, you don't always have to be a true believer, but it definitely helps.
I remember like my second week on my first campaign and I had to write something about whether like right to work policies in municipal government. I was like, what in the world? Shannon, how about you? What were you involved with in college that kind of led you this way?
Well, I definitely encourage students to try different things in college because that's the time to do it. I got involved with both the PLU Democrats and the Environmental Club. Hopefully, they're still around. So I led that. I led the PLU Democrats my senior year, and that was a really great experience because I worked with some U.S. senators to bring them to campus and have them visit campus. So like Senator Maria Cantwell came to campus, and I met a bunch of her staff that I still work with today in different capacities when they're moved on to different jobs. And I would say that I really explored environmental campaigns and environmental issues in college, and that's what certainly jump-started my passion on working in politics and the environment there, at the same time. The other thing I did in college was I got a job as a field director on a state House race that was a big one at the time. And so they had an additional staff role, which is rare for a state legislative race, but this particular race had that. And that gave me incredible experience to be a student at the time and have that part-time job. And so, and I interned at the city of Tacoma. That also helped too. So I had a lot of, I would say internships are a big thing. And then if you could get a paid gig, I am very happy to say that nowadays there's a lot more paid internships available that is than there was 15 years ago. And so I would look for those because paid internships usually tend to be more of a complete experience. And it means that the organization or the candidate has really thought about what they would like, how it's a give and take. You'll learn some things and you're also get paid for your work. So I encourage folks to dig those out because they're much more prevalent than they were, at least when I was around 15 years ago in school.
And Barbara, maybe you had mentioned kind of some things that you were involved with during your undergrad experience, but maybe we didn't quite get the full picture. Do you want to share anything else in that?
Yes, I was a highly involved student during undergrad, perhaps a little too involved. Let's see, what are some of the things I did? I worked in the Center for Gender Equity, and my position actually helped to bring the Elect Her experience to campus, which basically was a day-long conference that actually trained women to go into leadership and political positions. So I think that was just certainly one of my biggest boosts into getting into politics. Is it gave me an avenue to actually talk with local elected officials and to invite them to this event and get to know them a little bit more. So that way, in the future, they could vouch for me because they'd worked with me in that capacity. I also was in the Associate Students of Pacific Lutheran University for 3 years, serving as a senator, and then also as the vice president my senior year. Certainly that helped out a lot because it just meant that I got a ton of leadership experience, learned how to think really quick on my feet, but again, it also connected me with a lot of elected officials as we would bring them into campus and, also taught me a lot about the legislative process and Robert's Rules of Orders and things like that, which was super helpful. And then I also was involved in the Diversity Center, which was super, super nice because I think it's where I got most of my mentors from and most of the people that then had connections to other folks to get me in. I did not grow up in a political family. I had zero connections to politics and really anything before coming to PLU other than I did really well in my AP Gov class and I went to Girls State Camp, which is a government camp, my junior year of high school. But other than that, I had zero connections. So I think as someone that had that, it was really daunting to think about going into politics because I had no idea how to get in. So I think, the biggest thing that helped me out was just being in the right place at the right time, and specifically those 3 areas.
I'm going to add my answer too, just because I think it shows a little range. I've been trying not to share my experiences as the moderator, but I was going to PLU, but I wound up getting involved with the Democratic Party in Anchorage, which the Democratic Party in Anchorage is like 3 people in a strip mall. My parents weren't engaged, or they were engaged on the other side actually of the political aisle. But sometimes where you're from, if you're a student or if you're connected to a student, there might be opportunities kind of in less kind of politically like you just comparing like the landscape in Tacoma and Parkland and in Seattle, there's a lot of opportunity. There's also different opportunities, elsewhere. And so I wound up spending a summer at the Democratic Party of Alaska in their office, which it was the year Obama was running the first time, and Alaska for the first time was a swing state. And Obama campaign brought in staffers, and they were all like 24, and I was 19. I thought they were all the coolest three people I'd ever met. And then Palin got put on the ticket, and they all went home in like 2 hours, and I was very sad. But then I worked for them virtually from campus for 3 years. And then I wound up getting a campaign job, not in Alaska, not because they knew anyone there, but just because I wound up working for a candidate who had been dragging his feet, hiring a campaign manager. And I met the HDCC, which is kind of the organization that's run by the House Democrats. I met them at a job fair at PLU. And just because I had worked for the party in Alaska, that kind of helped me get on the radar here. And so you just never know how something that you're doing, if you're from Spokane, but you really want to live in Portland or Seattle, like still, if that's where your in is, then just start building that up, because these things are transferable. And it was kind of like, it was a validator on my resume that kind of was the important first step, even though I had never wanted to go back to Anchorage. No offense to Anchorage. We're gonna, if anyone out there, if anyone's hanging on and has one question, go ahead and ask it. We'll give a couple more minutes to ask a question, and then maybe we'll end a few minutes early. A couple of us have kids to put to bed. I want to, sometimes I think, especially in presidential years, people are thinking a lot about the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And, someone might come to the door and say like, hey, I'm endorsed by your local such and such a party. I always think there's kind of a misunderstanding of like what parties are in like local politics, because they're just people and they're just organizations that don't have a lot of money, but have other things. Like, what's the role of like politics, or what's the role of the party? Well, Barbara, you've been talking about this county council race that you're working on. Like, how does like the party, quote unquote, interact with a campaign like that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of twofold. I think if you're thinking about a really large race like the governor or certainly the president, the party certainly holds a lot more weight, and people are probably thinking of it as this giant organization. In terms of the county council race, the Pierce County Democrats is just like a group of folks that meet. They don't really have money to give to races. Same goes for the Pierce County Republicans. Like, these aren't people that have $50,000 to pour into a race. These are just people who are super, super interested in politics, who meet, and they're kind of known as the local organization. So what they do a lot of is helping to organize volunteers for your race. The people that show up to those meetings are really likely to do things like doorbell and phone bank for you, write postcards. Perhaps they will in-kind a couple hundred stamps for you. But for the most part, these aren't people that are going to be giving out tons of money and dictating everything about your race. Aaron mentioned earlier LDs, so your legislative district that you're in. Specifically for this one county council race that I'm doing for Janie, she covers the 28th legislative district and the 29th legislative district. And so really those are just small organizations of people who happen to live in that legislative district and fall one way or another politically, and they get together and have meetings, and they can do things like endorse you, and it means like these people have these specific values that they have up on their website and they've endorsed. But again, these aren't people that are giving you $70,000 in your race. Is something that you might see in terms of a presidential race. So I think when you're looking at that, really a lot more about it is kind of what's the platform of that group. And these groups do have platforms that are agreed upon by the members, and they have bylaws and everything. So they function, I kind of think they function a little bit like ASPLU does, just a little bit fancier and apart from a school organization, but certainly not the same as saying like the National Democratic Party endorses this person, which if that did happen, race would be a very, very big deal.
I wanted to touch on, this is something that we'll have Shannon talk about, because I think she's the most in this world, although I know Argo, where Barbara works, also works on independent expenditures. But we're getting to that time of the year where all of our mailboxes, ballots are going to drop here in Pierce County. They're going to be sent out tomorrow, and they'll be in our mailboxes mostly by Saturday and Monday. And we're going to get mail that has candidates' faces on it, and we're going to think that it came from that candidate, or we're going to think that it came from the candidate opposing that candidate, if it's a negative piece of mail, but it may or may not have. Can you tell us just like the 3-minute how independent expenditures work and how organizations choose whether or not they're going to be involved with the campaign or be involved on the IE side, as they say in the biz?
Sure. So in Washington State, we have election laws that say that an organization or individual can only give a certain amount of money, and that is either in cash, like a direct contribution, or in in-kind services to a candidate, and it varies based on level. So it's a bigger number for governor, it's a smaller number for a local race, but on average for a state legislative race, it's not very much money. It's a couple $1,000s. So for an organization that is really supportive of a certain candidate, they might choose to do what is called an independent expenditure. And by law, it is separate from the candidate. So if my organization, Washington Conservation Voters, and decides to do an independent expenditure for a candidate, we can't have any communication with that candidate. So it's completely separate. And so that just means that we can be involved in the race at a little bit more than we could if all we could do is write a direct check and that's it, or donate $2,000 of staff time. So it just allows us to do more to support the candidate. When we make our decisions, at least for my organization, we support upwards to 100 candidates. We endorse, I should say, up toward 100 candidates a cycle, but we usually pick a handful, 5 to 6, where we really go all in, or go, I should say 5 to 6 districts. So sometimes there's multiple candidates in a district that we're supporting. And so our independent expenditures are often field programs. So we've talked a lot about canvassing door to door. Well, if we wanted to do a lot of work and recruit a bunch of our volunteers, we have limits on how many people we can recruit and still recruit and kind of send over to a candidate campaign. So if we have a ton of volunteers that want to knock on doors, we have to set up a independent expenditure to do that work. And we make those decisions for us as a statewide organization. We pick races that we think are going to have the biggest value, both locally to protect air and water here in Washington State, but also kind of have a regional impact. Like what races will have some sort of regional impact that is an area that can do something that can snowball in other areas, or there's a big environmental fight on the ground locally that has a regional or statewide impact. So that's how we make our decisions.
Thank you. I know that's kind of like hard to be like, oh, can you give us the 3-minute version of that? But it's it's a big.
Hopefully that was okay.
Those of us for all on these campaigns, and it's an interesting part of Washington politics. I want to stop us here. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. For folks who are still hanging with us tonight, or folks who might watch us in the future, all these, Shannon, Barbara, and Aaron, their contact information is all on the websites of the organizations they work for. So once again, Shannon's with Washington Conservation Voters, Barbara's with Argo Strategies, Barbara? Argo Strategies. If you search Argo Seattle, you'll find them. And Aaron is with the King County Council. So if you want to reach out to any of them, you can find them on those websites. So thank you three very much for talking campaigns for an hour here, 2 weeks out from Election Day.